That's what this sounds like from trolls. An ineffective response or a good try response from an ally might sound like, FYI, we're a country of immigrants. And then a constructive addition, at ally, it's so hard to see commenters dehumanizing fellow human beings, but your comment warmed my heart. And here's a great article that talks about the asylum process and why people come to the border without documentation first. And you could also just say, pull one thing from that article, like if you're in a space where the link might not be as effective, pull one particular piece of information from that article that seems compelling and is accurate, and include that rather than include the link for your constructive addition. A second example for your structure, I'm scared about the amount of gun violence and drug addiction in the United States and find comfort in othering these problems. And so what that might sound like is they're bringing violence and drugs with them. Ineffective response, but good try from an ally might sound like white men cause mass violence in the US, but you don't see plans to prevent them from coming into the country. I'm pretty sure I've said like something like that, like word for word before, multiple times. And then a constructive addition to that might sound like immigration does not increase violence. At ally, you hit it on the head. And as this article shows, the reports back you up. So that's an attempt at a constructive addition. This constructive additions are not perfect by any means, but it kind of builds upon, what the initial response by the ally, what the ally was, and hopefully creates more space to have more conversation that's pro-immigrants' rights. So now I want you all to try to make your own constructive additions for these two examples. The first example, sorry, my kid is being loud in the background. The first example sounds like they're stealing our jobs and draining our resources. And then the good try response from ally is, don't blame immigrants just because you can't find a job. And then the second sounds like, if you don't like this country, go back. And the good try response, whatever happened to freedom of speech? So remember, I want you to try responding to the ally, not responding directly to the troll, responding to what the ally says. Definitely keep in mind the fear structure behind what the troll said, but we're responding to, don't blame immigrants just because you can't find a job, and building upon that constructively. And we're responding to whatever happened to freedom of speech and building upon that constructively. So take a few moments to think about how you might make a constructive addition, and go ahead and type that in the chat. Also, as you're doing this, if you have any questions about either just the last piece on immigrants' rights and sort of the framing of it and the traps, if you have questions about that, go ahead and feel free to add them to the Q&A as well.
One question we got, Amanda, was can we quickly go over why the ineffective responses are ineffective?
Okay, so for this one, if we're thinking about the building blocks, right, and thinking about the traps, we want it to be a positive message, and we want it to be accurate, compelling, and we want it to be accessible. So not overly jargony, and also inclusive and expansive enough that other people can see themselves represented in what we're saying and the message that we're putting out about immigrants' rights. And so for this one, the ineffective response, don't blame immigrants just because you can't find a job. It's not positive. It's not, it also falls into the trap that I mentioned about dividing up immigrants versus non-immigrants. So it does nothing to try to find common ground or actually push any sort of like positive vision for immigrants' rights. It literally is just, a negative response to a negative response. The second one, I think, right here, to me, and I would be curious to hear other people's opinions on why this one is ineffective, but it just is not particularly compelling, doesn't provide any new information. It's not overly negative, but it's not overly positive either. It's an attempt. It's better than saying nothing, but it's just not particularly compelling. It's very vague, kind of trope. And I think, as you all read, the sort of rights-based messaging, unfortunately, doesn't work. Doesn't tend to work. So in the example of marriage equality, saying people have a right to get married was not as effective as like saying something like people should be able to choose who they love. So citing like a particular right, or a constitutional right, from what we've learned, isn't actually a particularly compelling or effective message.
Thanks, Amanda. And we got some good responses. Would you like me to read them out, or do you want to read them out?
Yeah, if you could read them, Nora, that'd be great.
Awesome. Okay. So we got one that from Elizabeth Downing that says, it is sometimes difficult to find a good job. All those who are searching can feel frustrated. Thanks to Ally for pointing out that some of that frustration can be misplaced. Another one is from Judy that says, Ally, you are so right. Americans are losing jobs for so many reasons, especially AI and technology. Here's an article that shows the effect of AI on American job loss. The third is from Gina. Agreed, Ally. Immigrants usually don't apply for standard jobs, and they don't have access to benefits until they've attained citizenship, though they do pay taxes. Here's a link to more information. So let's start with those three, Amanda, and then we can go to the next.
Yeah, I really like these responses. And I think in Elizabeth Downing, in your response, all those who are searching can feel frustrated. That feels really inclusive and expansive to me. And really, even though you're responding to the ally, you're speaking to something that is a fear structure that many people might be experiencing at this moment. So many people who are seeing that constructive addition could see themselves represented in that comment. And then also just saying, yeah, a lot of times the frustration can be misplaced. That feels like definitely one that is positive and inclusive for sure. And then yes, I think Judy pointing out like there's so many reasons why Americans are losing jobs. It's not the fault of immigrants. Here's the effect of AI on American job loss, and basically just speaking to the fact that it is a widespread problem. I would say one way to maybe improve that slightly would be to not remove immigrants from the response entirely, and actually think of a way that you can still affirm that, like, the pro-immigrant values that we're trying to share here. So maybe saying something like, all of us are in this together. Immigrants are trying to, feed their families just like everyone else is. Something to that effect, to just make sure that we don't accidentally invisibilize immigrants from the conversation. But I think that definitely the positivity and the inclusiveness in that one is right on. And then this one from Gina is great because it gives really concrete information that some people might not know. And so that's accurate information, and it's pretty compelling. It's something that is positive. I would say the only thing here that, yeah, I would be a little bit hesitant to say all immigrants, because it sounds like you're referring to undocumented immigrants in particular, right? So just being careful about making sure that you're being precise and being accurate, because you could be called out, or you have pushback on that in some of the statements that you're making here.
Amanda, I really like this one from River. It says, like at Ally said, there are many, many reasons why we have trouble finding jobs, but immigration is not one of them. Ever since the Great Recession, large firms have focused on retaining capital over expanding or improving their workforce. Another really good one is from Melissa. I agree that it's not effective to blame immigrants. I think it's important that we connect with each other and say, hey, both American citizens and new immigrants are having trouble finding jobs. This seems like a greater systemic issue if it was already happening internally, and that's something we need to continue talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think these sort of responses are really my fave tend to be what I would consider particularly effective, because it's instead of helping people to focus horizontally or focus downward on their blame, actually targeting the frustration at whoever is actually the source of this frustration, right? So, hey, Shucks. So yeah, these are some of my favorite responses that are really showing how there's folks who are really actually very greedy and hoarding a lot of wealth and making it impossible for other people to have access to jobs and have access to things that they need. And it's not immigrants, right? It's these folks that are being called out in those responses. So I really like those.
Amanda, knowing it's almost 3:30, do you want to tackle some of the responses to the freedom of speech? Maybe we can take 5 minutes to do that.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe let's just do a couple if you can read them out.
Yeah, of course. And I think this is one of the hard ones, because we hear freedom of speech and like other American tenets, right? Like being used so broadly in attacks on other people. So here we see one. At Ally, so true that we're so lucky to have freedom of speech. It's great to have an open dialogue about change so we can support each other navigating into the future. At Ally, thank you for reminding us that we all have the right to free speech. I think a big problem facing immigrant rights is how they've been denied some of our core American freedoms. And then another one is, at Ally, freedom of speech is a good way to voice your concerns and opinions and possibly educate other people as well. And then another one is, at Ally, freedom of speech is important because it allows everyone to improve this country for everyone versus leaving problems for other people to solve. Thank you for bringing this up.
Yeah, I think this is good. And I think it's really, right on. It is difficult to respond to this because we're not responding to the troll. We're only responding to the freedom of speech, and it is so vague. But I think these are great, great responses. I would say if we could really kind of try to center humans, have a human-centered response.
Look at this.
Human-centered response in our constructive editions, it's really helpful. So saying things like, like I think a big problem facing immigrant rights is how they've been denied some of our core American freedoms. I think is really excellent way to make sure that we're continuing to show our pro-immigrants rights values in our constructive editions, and center humans in our response instead of like the general like nebulous idea of, these particular freedoms. I think you're muted.
Oh, yep. Thank you, Amanda. So I think, just so you all know, I know that this was useful, is the messaging I'm getting from folks. But the good news is that this template is one that we're going to use for every issue area. So I know Amanda's sharing some hashtags. And again, once we're through with this training, you'll have access to a full toolkit that has all these hashtags. So thank you, Amanda, for sharing these. And this is how you can begin to sort of see where these conversations are happening, what hashtags are being used and populated, and be able to monitor some of these conversations and do some reading on your own. So next steps, thank you, Amanda, for everything that you do, and hello to the kids, and I really appreciate all the wisdom you brought to us. So we're gonna take a 15-minute break. This was already planned, so not a surprise, but I was intending to have us come back by 3:45. I'd like for us to still stick to it. And then we're gonna move into our second deep dive into an issue area using the same fear structure and template, talking about trans exclusionary feminism, so transphobia in feminist spaces, how to intervene and engage in those situations. So feel free to hop off. Please don't log out. And I'll see you back here at 3:45. Thank you.
Is the right. So for about 40 years now, we have been analyzing, synthesizing, watching trends, looking at how the right wing builds power, the networks, the leaders, the organizations, the movements of the right, specifically the religious right, the evangelical and Catholic rights here in the United States, and how those movements and organizations shift power, shift wealth, and shift ideas across the globe. And I specifically do our anti-LGBTQ monitoring and research. So right now I focus on, as I'm doing right here, anti-trans feminism and their partnerships with the right, specifically the evangelical right, in order to give anti-trans advocacy kind of a veneer of a broader base of support than it actually has. I also research child welfare's use as a tool of white supremacy. I research conversion therapy and who advocates for conversion therapy, and I convene a global monitoring group of folks who look at the spread of gender ideology rhetoric, which is a kind of a catchphrase out of the Vatican used to harm queer people, people accessing abortion, feminists, you know, everybody. So Nora or Kate, do we have someone who volunteered to read the clip from the Women's Agenda?
Absolutely. And just so folks know, this is from the overall LGBTQ section on from the Women's Agenda and some of the things we've been asking for. So Deborah, I am going to unmute you now, and you should be able to speak.
Hi. We demand full federal funding to do the work of ending gender-based violence. Funds distributed must prioritize community-based organizations outside of law enforcement and be focused on survivors to prevent further state violence or state-sanctioned violence against communities of color, immigrant communities, indigenous people, and LGBTQIA+ communities, especially trans people of color. We must seek policy at the federal level that ensures the safety and protection of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, queer, intersex, asexual, gender nonconforming, and non-binary youth, young women and girls from discrimination in schools.
Yay, thank you so much. Before we go on to the practicing of our disruptions, I wanted to give a little bit of background here about why I focus on researching anti-trans feminists. I can also give a little bit of background on who anti-trans feminists are, but honestly, that's less important to this conversation than what they're doing, who they're working with, and what they say. So one of the main reasons I focus on researching the networks on connections of anti-trans feminists is two major events that happened in early last year, where Republicans in the House Ways and Means Committee, I believe, brought in a single witness to testify against the Violence Against Women Act and the Equality Act, which is the federal bill that would prohibit discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Violence Against Women Act, but it is the funding mechanism that allows federal funds to flow from, I believe it's the Health and Human Services and the Department of Justice to anti-violence programs across the country. And the singular witness that was brought by the Republicans in both of those hearings was this woman named Julia Beck, who, is she a physician? No. Is she an anti-violence expert? No. Is she a professor or an expert in some area relevant to anti-violence or relevant to LGBT discrimination? No. Her singular claim to fame was that she is an anti-trans feminist. And that she had been removed from the Baltimore City Council LGBT law and policy group for complaining about the presence of a trans woman on the council. And the fact that the Republicans chose her as the singular witness against these two really huge, important pieces of legislation was really striking and deserved a much deeper investigation. And so I have spent the last year, among other projects, like I said, building out a deeper understanding with the hope of many trans folks across the past 40 years who have really taken the time to investigate these feminists who are attacking the validity of trans lives, to build out a network of understanding and to look at how it came that these Republicans called this one woman as a witness And it became clear to me that anti-trans feminists in the United States and in the UK and in Australia are partnering really closely with the evangelical right in order to give the evangelical right's anti-trans agenda. And I'm talking about organizations like the Heritage Foundation, the Alliance Defending Freedom, Family Policy Alliance, Family Research Council, to give their agenda, like I said, the veneer of a broader base of support. And so that is the context with which we can go into the next areas. I want to make sure there are any questions. Nora, are there any questions I should address right now before we move into the disruptions?
If folks have any at this point, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, and we can just give it a few seconds to see if we have anything in particular.
Perfect. Oh, and I see Teddy asking here, can I just say I understand anti-trans feminists less than most of these other groups? I'm happy to address that right now. And as Nor saw in my deeper training on anti-trans feminists, the way I see it is folks who are proximal to power, but are still not the powerful group. And in this case, I call women, the white women specifically, the people who are proximal to power, but they're still not white men. So they are not granted automatic passage, automatic power in many instances, who are infected by a scarcity mindset. That is, they believe that there is a set amount of resources to create health and safety and well-being for everyone in our society, will try to draw lines between who deserves health and safety and well-being, who deserves access to those resources, and who does not. And so for white cis women, that line, for some of them, anti-trans feminists, that line will be using biological essentialism, right? So we think that people who have vaginas, I'm just going to be super clear about it, we think people who have vaginas deserve access to those resources, to health and safety and well-being. And we're going to draw the line at people who don't have vaginas or who we don't think have vaginas and say that those are the people who don't deserve our scarce resources. And you can apply that kind of scarcity abundance mindset to a lot of different instances where you see people who are proximal to power but don't have unfettered access to that power will draw lines to say why they deserve it and why others don't.
Thanks, Heron. And another question I got was around, and I know we put feminists in a quotation marks, right?
Yeah,
could you
I no longer do that.
Okay, all right, all about it.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. You know, when I was first starting this project, I put feminist in quotes, and then I got pushback from a lot of people of color, queer folks of color, women of color, who were like, you can't do that. These people are feminists. Feminism has a history of racism, a history of trans exclusion, a history of colonialism, obviously, a history of genocide. And by putting feminists in quotes, when referring to anti-trans feminists, you're erasing the painful, powerful history that feminism has. And so now I no longer put it in quotes. Anti-trans feminists are people who use feminist theory to exclude trans folks.
Thank you, Heron, for that wonderful summary.
Yeah.
And no worries, Teddy. That is also how I had seen it used, and I know that we've been talking about all the learning and unlearning, and this is a moment of unlearning.
Yeah, I mean, I literally had to unlearn that. That's like me a year ago versus today. So please do not beat yourself up about that.
All good, all good. All right, we can move on to the next slide, Kate. Yeah. The one back. Yeah, you can go back. Yep.
Yep. So here are the main tactics, a few of the main tactics that I see anti-trans feminists using. I'm trying to move my video to where I can see what I'm talking about and see me at the same time, because I like looking at myself. I'm so cute. Okay, so here's some main tactics that I see, and you're going to notice that these are tactics that you'll see a lot of different anti-trans groups using. These are not singular to anti-trans feminists, but the first is this focus on gender-based violence. Many anti-trans feminists will call it sex-based violence, because one of the tenets of anti-trans feminism is that gender is not real, that sex is not perceived but recorded at birth. that is, and I apologize for being very graphic, that is when the doctor looks between the baby's legs and writes down what they see. Anti-trans feminists believe that that is a truth that cannot be disputed. So anti-trans feminists believe that gender-based violence is the fault of trans women, and that, again, I'm, River mentioned about 20 minutes ago when we were on break, I don't know River's pronouns, that they were very nervous about this topic, and I apologize. This is going to be very heavy. But anti-trans feminists believe that trans women are not real, and that cis men are taking advantage of LGBT non-discrimination protections in order to access cisgender only women's spaces. The second here, this is the scarcity model, insisting that rights are scarce and that protecting people from discrimination on the basis of gender identity somehow invalidates protections on the basis of sex. This was the gist of Julia Beck's testimony in her against the Violence Against Women Act, that interpreting sex to include gender identity, which is already done in states across the country, and women haven't exploded, trust me, that would have been in the news, that interpreting sex to include gender identity somehow erases women as a protected class, and therefore women would not have access to those needed protections. And the third here I brought in was, this claim is rampant among all anti-trans sectors, claiming that trans people recruit and harm children. And not only is this claim rampant across all anti-trans sectors, it's actually rampant across pretty much any right-wing rhetoric you could see. I mean, you see it in anti-immigration rhetoric. You see it in anti-Semitic rhetoric. If you may have heard of the blood libel rhetoric, this is a 1,000-year-old rhetoric claiming that Jewish people harm children and recruit children. So it's very easy to call in children as the victims of a population that you don't want to receive protections. Nora, Kate, do we have any questions about these tactics?
Yeah. One that we got was, if you could give an example of the first argument of the blaming gender-based violence on transgender women.
Yeah. So there's two ways I see it. I see it forming. The first is that I mentioned that cis men will take advantage of non-discrimination laws to access cisgender women's only spaces. There is a whole rhetoric around bathroom bills that if you allow people to access necessary facilities based on their gender identity, that somehow people who want to harm women and girls will use that as an excuse to enter, or a license to enter those spaces to harm women and girls. Of course, we know two things. First, that people who want to harm women and girls never need an excuse. They never need a non-discrimination law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of gender identity in order to enter those spaces and harm people. Second, actually we know three things. Second, we know that it's not strangers entering spaces that perpetuate most gender-based violence. It's people who we know really well. And again, who don't need a non-discrimination law to access a place to harm someone they want to harm. They have access to that person already. And the third thing we know is empirically that laws that prohibit discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, even those laws that prohibit discrimination in places of public accommodation, that's access to necessary facilities, there is literally no uptake in gender-based crimes in those areas that can be drawn back to the existence of those laws at all.
Thanks, Heron. Another question, and I think I can answer this from Deborah around why we're focusing on transphobia. I would say from women, from women rather than looking at the full spectrum of transphobia, is because I would say that the Women's March base and the majority of people that attend our trainings and are part of our networks do identify as feminists, right? And that's why they're drawn to the Women's March. So that's why we've really been focusing on how we see transphobia play out in these spaces amongst people who proclaim, you know, an attachment to feminism. So I would answer that, because I do think we could talk about transphobia as a whole, but when we're talking about the things that we see and can intervene in most easily, you know, that's why the focus is where it's at right now. And all right, so we can go ahead, Heron, and then we can get to the rest of the questions later.
Great.
All right, we can move to the next slide, Kate.
Yay, let's do some practicing. Okay, so here, just like in Amanda's section, these first two are going to be, I'll just walk through them and then answer any questions that anyone has. And then there's two more on the next slide that we can respond to together and do some of our own disruption practicing. So the first fear structure that I identify, and this goes back a little bit to the question that Nora was just answering, why we're focusing on anti-trans feminism versus transphobia as a whole, is because anti-trans feminism has specific rhetoric and fear structures that allow themselves to replicate in more progressive left spaces, versus someone using anti-trans slurs, for example, or things that can be easily refuted or blocked or muted. Anti-trans feminism smartly uses rhetoric that, again, relies on feminism. So you has these frameworks that are sly and seem like they make perfect sense when you think of them through a feminist frame. And this is one of the reasons why the evangelical right and the Catholic right are platforming anti-trans feminists, because they're using language that the evangelical right and the Catholic right could never use successfully without seeming disingenuous. So the first one here is, we need to focus on real women. And what this sounds like, obviously, is trans women aren't real, and that real women are suffering. And if you look through the scarcity mindset, if trans women aren't real and real women are suffering, therefore trans women and trans people in general must be taking something away from real women. So the ineffective response, the well-meaning ally would respond knee-jerk, trans women are women. The reason that is not entirely effective is what I have added here in the constructive addition. Real is actually a pretty harmful construct. None of us here are real women. If you go down a tick box of what a real woman is, I mean, what's a real woman? Is she the 5'8", blonde, 36, 24, 36, 2.5 kids, also has a job, or is she the stay-at-home brunette, evangelical, wears a denim skirt down to the floor? Or is she the, really curvy model? Is she 16? Is she 80? Real is harmful. Not all women menstruate. Not all women can get pregnant or want to. Not all women were socialized the same. That's another claim that anti-trans feminists make, that we all have a unique socialization that bounds us together as women. That's patently not true. So this is slightly different than Amanda's frame. And Noor, do you want me to talk about what you could say to this ally?
Yeah, that would be useful. That would be useful if you could run through that.
Sure. I guess I would say, yeah, absolutely. Trans women are women. And also, everyone deserves protection on the basis of their gender identity, because we all have one. And then something that I always find helpful when talking to people who are accidentally replicating anti-trans feminist rhetoric is to bring in a personal story. This cuts through the bullshit so much. I look in many ways like a stereotypical woman, maybe like a hipster woman. But I'm in fact agender. I also had a miscarriage. I also had my fallopian tubes removed. I also parent a kid that I didn't give birth to. These are all important things that help complicate realness. But do I not deserve protection from employment discrimination or housing discrimination based on my gender identity? Of course I do, because I'm a person, not because of whether I'm a woman or not. The next fear structure is biology isn't bigotry. To explain this a little bit more, anti-trans feminists use this to justify and excuse when they say that there's only two sexes and you can't change your sex. They say biology isn't bigotry. What that sounds like is obviously transness isn't real. Trans people are deluding themselves in order to access women's spaces, to harm them, et cetera, et cetera. An ineffective response, or a well-meaning response by a well-meaning ally, would be, you're a bigot. The constructive addition would be, I mean, I don't know how to constructively add to "you're a bigot," and maybe Nor can help with this, but my complication, my disruption would be, biology has actually been used as bigotry for a hell of a long time. And we talk about, you know, like slavery, enslaved people, that was literally based on biology. Can we talk about like genocide of indigenous folks? Like, that was literally based on biology. Why women weren't allowed to vote for a very long time? Biology. Like, you know, please don't tell me that biology isn't bigotry. Science is only as equal as the people who wield it to justify their actions. And science now is showing us this incredible complexity of human gender and sexual orientation. And we are now realizing that there are not 4 or 10 or 40 genders or sexual orientations. There are 7 billion, because each of us has a unique combination of a gender identity, chromosomes, internal, external sex organs, hormone production, hormone uptake, reproductive capacity. I mean, you get it. Every single person has a unique sexual orientation and gender identity.
Thanks for saying that, Heron. I would respond the same way. I think also just rooted in the fact that there are cultures where biological essentialism isn't actually how gender is constructed or viewed, right? Like, there are so many cultures around the world that speak to the fact that this is a result of colonialism and a result of imperialism across the world that forces us into these boxes as well.
Absolutely.
That's probably, you know, like if that's something that you know about and you want to add that to your constructive edition, I would. And then another question, Heron, that came up that I think we can answer right now is, we're focusing on replying to ineffective responses, but shouldn't we also amplify all responses of allies? Agreed, Victoria. I mean, I think that when we're talking about this type of intervention, where we're intervening with words, where we're, you know, attempting to add a little bit more meat to what they're saying in order to sort of like shift the narrative on the thread, I think it makes sense to go in like this, but there's no reason that we shouldn't uplike or upvote or have some emojis whenever someone's on the right side. You know, as we were discussing earlier, there's an algorithm, and us supporting anyone that's doing well is absolutely the bare minimum that we should be doing.
Yeah, and I am 100% on board with what Amanda was saying about muting. Oh my God, mute is amazing. Sometimes, don't tell anybody this, but sometimes I'll kind of like piss someone off a little bit and then mute them on purpose so that they're just yelling at silence. But don't do that. That is not effective. It is not effective communication strategy, but it is very cathartic. But yeah, mute everyone. Just go down and literally like mute every single person who is clearly a troll.
Yep, absolutely. All right, on to the next slide.
Let's do some practicing. Okay, so these are, well, the first one is something that I'm hearing a lot right now, obviously, with Idaho banning trans girls from competing in sports openly. And then the second one is relates back to that child recruitment narrative that we're seeing a lot right now, manifesting as the bans in some cities against drag queen story hours, because people do not know the difference between trans folks and drag queens, but that's neither here nor there. Okay, so the first one, the fear structure is trans people will dominate at sports. Read, you know, if we allow trans folks to compete openly in their gender identity. Sounds like fear. Trans women and girls are scary. An ineffective or a well-meaning ally would respond, trans people aren't gonna dominate in sports, duh. And then please add your constructive addition in the chat. The next fear structure is, these poor gender confused children are being recruited by trans rights activists. And a little context for this is, there is a growing subculture community of people who claim that trans folks are preying on children who are gay or lesbian, or non-gender conforming, like tomboys and femme boys, and also preying on children who have autism, and telling them that they are not gay, lesbian, gender non-conforming, or autistic, but that they are in fact trans. So this sounds like, obviously, trans people are stealing children. An ineffective response, although this is a great response from a well-meaning ally, would be like, Pizzagate much? Pizzagate was all about claiming the Democratic Party and Hillary Clinton specifically were recruiting and stealing children for sex slavery. So I will give you a couple minutes to add some possible constructive additions to the allies, or as I call them, like disruptions of replication of rhetoric. And also let me know if you have any questions.
Absolutely. And in the meantime, folks, if when you're putting the your responses in the chat, if you could just say which one you're responding to, that'll help when we workshop them and I read some of them out. So take your time to put those in. Maybe we can take, oh, we're doing great on time. Maybe we can take like 3 minutes.
Wow.
I know, very generous. But in the meantime, we have a good question, Karen, that I'm hoping we can answer. It's from Ayushi. And the question is, my concern often is when we use the all individuals are humans argument and therefore deserving of the same rights and treatment, might they give these folks the opportunity to then negate equity? How does one respond to that or try to make sure that doesn't happen?
I would love if Ayushi could clarify a little bit.
I can unmute Ayushi.
Yeah. I mean, I think that people who fundamentally do not believe in the government's role in stepping in and protecting folks against discrimination or affirmatively granting folks rights and access to services and benefits that they need, they will use any excuse that we give them at all to say that, oh, what you're saying is, to try and catch us, right? To catch us in an illogical framework or whatever they want. I think to clarify what I meant by, everyone deserves protection on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity is that truly the laws, the way they're constructed in the United States, they do not denote special classes. We are all protected from discrimination on the basis of race. We are all protected from discrimination on the basis of sex. We are all protected from discrimination in the states that have them, like in Massachusetts, from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. That's because we all have a race. We all have a sex, although that's becoming more complexly understood now. And we all have a sexual orientation and a gender identity. So as much as someone should not be discriminated against on the basis of their gender identity that is not the same as the sex the doctors thought they were at the time of their birth, so should someone be not discriminated against on the basis of a gender identity that matches the sex a doctor thought they were at the time of their birth.
Ayushi, does that answer your question, or do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Thank you for clarifying it. I think it actually kind of does answer my question. But when I raised the question, I was more thinking about international laws. Thankfully, in a lot of ways, fortunately, unfortunately, a lot of new laws, international laws are coming up. I mean, they're not being implemented by member states, and that's a whole issue in itself. But a lot of new subdivisions to existing laws are coming up, right? People have been recommending for years for a more broader framework for the CEDAW, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And when we come across these people who call themselves feminists, and I think I'm still where you were a year ago, because I do not understand how a person can call themselves a feminist if they do not adhere to the very simple principle of, oh, well, we believe in equality and probably hopefully have some common sense. But I think, yes, it does answer my question. I'm just worried about generalizing our terminology too much to make it accessible to people.
Yeah, I hear you. Thank you.
Yeah, being able to speak to the nuance of the specific experience, right, without letting it get subsumed. I hear you on that front, especially I think in global discourse, we're so used to the like, we are the world approach to things, and we know that that's proven to be ineffective for global equity. All right, friends. So we have some really, really good responses here. So I'm going to start off with the first one and read out some of the ones that I'm seeing. So one of them is, is trans folks have already been allowed in sports for ages and we already aren't dominating. So, all right.
Yeah, data. Bring that data. I love data as a disruption.
And then we have one that is, does right. I think it is so important to move away from binary-based competitive play and center around lifting up our youth achievement regardless of identity.
I saw this one. I love this one so much. Honestly, that is like the perfect response. I don't want to say anyone's better than anyone else, but that one's great.
What makes it so appealing, Heron?
I personally also believe that we need to move away from gender-based sports, sex-based sports, whatever, wherever you are on the spectrum to call them right now. I think that we are in a very uncomfortable liminal space right now where we are realizing that gender divisions in sports are actually not super helpful from every single level, from little tiny tots playing soccer who don't even know what team they're on, all the way up to elite sports. We're seeing that the lines between athletes are not based on gender, but they're actually based on weight and class, right? So another argument that trans exclusionary feminists use against trans women competing in sports is that trans women will hurt cis women, that they are stronger and bigger and will hurt cis women. That has always been true. When you pit people who are of a different weight and class against one another, the person in the lower weight and class is always in danger. That's why boxing and wrestling are divided by weight and class. And we also know that the bell curves, I guess they are bell curves, of athletic ability taper down to such a fine point for everyone when you reach that elite level. We absolutely should be having everyone compete against one another at that high elite level. The differences between genders up there are so minute when you look at weight and class.
Thanks, Heron. And just so you all know, you all are saying great things. I'm just scrolling through and picking a few that if I'm not reading yours, that's only because I can't read all of them.
Yeah, it's like amazing. I'm reading them too. They're amazing.
So we just got one. Here's another good one. Is from River, and this is an approach that we haven't seen yet, which is trans folks aren't dominating in sports. Well, it starts with get it. Trans folks aren't dominating in sports. We see stories of victorious trans women in sports because the stories of them failing doesn't sell papers or subscriptions. Trans women's successes in sport are far, far overreported.
Yeah, absolutely. That kind of exceptionalism is something used by the right over and over again. That exceptionalism will be used in anti-immigrant rhetoric as well. We don't see stories of people who are migrants living lives because that doesn't sell papers. We see stories of some people hurting other people because some people of every migrant status hurt people and some people of every gender identity hurt people, but it's those sensational stories that sell papers.
Mm-hmm. I see another, a different take here as well, which is world-class athletes are outstanding examples of hard work and athleticism. I appreciate their performance. Gender self-identification is the only realistic way for athletes to participate in all the activities they choose.
Yes!
Karen, what do you see that's like a little bit different with that take?
Bringing in gender self-ID, which is not something we talk a lot about in the US, but is enormous in the UK right now, is really important. Anti-trans feminists are trying to claim that gender self-ID erases sex, erases women, that it's not scientific, that biology isn't bigotry, et cetera, et cetera. But truly, gender self-ID is the wave of the future. It's how sports will be in 40 years. I say 40 because I'm kind of pessimistic and nihilistic about it, but like, there's absolutely no way that we're gonna have like what's between your legs divided sports in 40 years as more and more elite athletes, like you're saying, are supportive of self-reported ID.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Heron. So I'm going to move into answering question number 2, but in the meantime, I'm wondering if you have any good resources on sports and gender.
Yep. Athlete Ally is the LGBT sports org who is doing a really phenomenal job at answering these questions and not letting anti-trans folks who may also be gay or lesbian derail the conversation. So this is a LGBTQ group that supports athletes. It was started by, I believe, a cis gay wrestler maybe, or a cyclist, who really absolutely understands that we are in this space transitioning between what's between your legs, divided sports, and gender self-ID, class, weight, et cetera, what we're doing. I would follow them on every media possible.
Thanks, Erin.
Yeah.
And we'll be sure to put this again in the resource toolkit that you'll get at the end of tomorrow. So looking through some of the second row on Pizzagate. So we got one from Judy that says, at Ally, LOL, you bring up a good point. This argument of others recruiting children for illicit purposes have been used by so many groups in power to recruit and manipulate others to their cause and diminish those just fighting for their rights.
Oh, amazing. So good.
Then we have another one from Sam Pearson, and it says, Pizzagate, tell me about it. The scary part about this is that it is just yet another instance of projection. We've been seeing this for years. People making accusations of people on the left stealing children when the current administration is actually stealing children at the border. Snap for that one.
Yes.
That was a really brilliant tie together. That. And then we have another one from Christina that says, at Ally, thanks for highlighting the ridiculousness of seeing trans people as running a conspiracy. In fact, children themselves sometimes realize that their gender identity does not match their birth sex without any outside influence. What did you think about that one? That was a little different, Erin.
Yeah, I think what's different about that obviously is it raises up this the data we have around when kids know their gender, right? And it shows that folks know their gender as early as 3, and then it's pretty settled by the time they're 5. And of course, that does not negate the fact that gender is also fluid, like sexual orientation, and people can experience different genders throughout their lives and also learn new words and ways to express their gender identity, which may change throughout their lives as well. I didn't identify as agender until about a year ago when I had this really powerful conversation with a couple of friends and allies, and we just came into this understanding that I actually don't have a gender. And so whenever we reveal ourselves, we should be understood. And all science shows that many children who grow up to identify as trans knew that around 3 or 5 years old. The second thing is that we never question cisgender children's gender, ever, no matter when they start identifying it. We glue tiny bows onto girls, onto people with vaginas, babies with vaginas, heads, so that people don't confuse them in their strollers. I think that's great.
Yeah. And River had a good one, which is good reference at Ally. In truth, you can't force someone to be trans anymore that you could force someone to be an astronaut.
Yes. Though wouldn't that be great if we just forced everyone to be an astronaut and sent them into space? Certain people, certain specific people who probably should go to space forever.
Yeah. Madeline asks, well, I will bring that up in the Q&A. But let's see. I think we're mostly done with the responses. So let's actually go into some of the questions that are coming up.
Great. Well done, everybody. You're going to be amazing.
Good job. That was on point. So the first is that people are asking for more resources. So if you have any references that we can turn to get a little bit read up on this, that would be awesome.
Yeah.
Are there any blogs or news sources that you like?
Yeah, I mean, all of the major transgender groups in the US have incredible resources, not specifically on anti-trans feminism, but on the data behind what it means to be trans and the diverse experiences that trans folks face. I mean, I'll bring in here that unsurprisingly, it's trans folks of color, Black trans women, Indigenous trans folks, Latinx trans folks who face the brunt of the transphobia from anti-trans feminism. You may know the case that came out of coming out of Connecticut, in which 2 cis girls are suing the state of Connecticut for their non-discrimination policy that allows folks to compete in sports based on their gender identity. And the 2 people that they are specifically complaining about are these Black trans girls who won 3 races in track. But that is not a coincidence. Black trans women, Indigenous trans women, Latinx trans women are the brunt of anti-trans feminism because of how anti-trans feminism intersects with racism, intersects with classism, and intersects with anti-immigrant bias in all of the ways that you can predict.
Thank you. Can you, would you mind?
Follow the trans orgs, sorry. Yeah. So National Center for Transgender Equality, Transgender Law Center, the Sylvia Rivera Law Project is another incredible resource. And then I can also send Noor a couple Twitter accounts that I follow that are absolutely phenomenal for my understanding of transness. But Raquel Willis, I'll put her in she is a Black trans journalist who is absolutely phenomenal.
Raquel Willis, yes, that name.
And then Translash is on Instagram, and they are a documentary team led by a Black trans woman. Really, really amazing work right now. They show some of their clips on Instagram.
Thank you. Awesome. Cool. So I just want to see if there's any remaining questions, if folks want to put that in the Q&A. Alyssa had a question that she submitted a while ago and I missed, which is
this question, yes.
Do you know what TERF's general stance on intersex people is? I hadn't thought about that until this moment, so I'm curious.
Yeah, they don't know what to say either. So some anti-trans feminists say that trans folks are co-opting the language of intersex people in order to claim that gender identity is a thing, essentially saying that trans folks are misunderstanding the complexity of human gender and sex and using that complexity in order to claim that trans folks deserve to live, I guess. Some anti-trans feminists don't believe that intersexuality is a thing, and that no matter whether you are intersex or not, you are either male or female. I don't think that these people are educated on intersex issues at all, and do not understand, genital difference, or understand that intersex conditions manifest in millions of ways. Genital difference, chromosomal difference, hormonal difference, sex characteristic difference. But yeah, postfis.
Mm-hmm.
Nora's like, yeah, postfis, definitely a word.
Go for it.
I want to postfis this by saying that although I believe in the scarcity framework, I also don't try super hard to understand what anti-trans feminist logic is, because it is at its heart illogical, the same as racism is at its heart illogical. We can understand the steps it took for someone to become a racist, or what logic they apply to their own racism or their own sexism, their own transphobia, their own anti-immigrant sentiment. But there is illogic along that way. So do not press yourself to understand fully, to comprehend the logic. I just got a clap from Ashley. Thank you for your clap.
Yeah, I also think part of it is when we're going into the fear structure argument, the reason you're not seeing us like address that fear structure in the constructive edition is because we don't want to validate their logic by doing so,
Yes.
right? But it helps us understand where they're coming from.
Yes.
But not necessarily reiterating that, because that is something the far right loves doing, right? Is like using what you're saying to legitimize their illogic. So
I saw River, shout out to Callie Wright. Queer Explaining podcast is amazing. It's so good. It's this like very personal diary interview podcast. It's incredible. And I also was on it.
oh, that makes it even better. All right, my friends. So let's move on to the next slide, Kate. Hashtags to follow. Heron, anything you want to say on this front?
Yeah, these are just great hashtags. Girls like us, boys like us, and trans is beautiful are both trans-led hashtags, so I really encourage you follow those. TDOR and TDOV are Trans Day of Remembrance and Trans Day of Visibility, which happen at different times around the year. Trans Day of Remembrance is a time for folks to remember those harmed by anti-trans violence, specifically trans folks killed by anti-trans violence. And then even more specifically, the majority of those are trans women of color. And then Trans Day of Visibility is, I wouldn't say the opposite of Trans Day of Remembrance, but it's a moment to lift up the folks who are still with us, the folks doing the amazing work to be visible, the folks who are able to be visible, and the folks who whose work should be visible but is not because of transphobia. So make sure you follow both of those too.
Thank you. Thanks, Heron. You're the best. Everyone says we're so impressed with Heron. I've learned so much. And also, are you okay with people following you on social media?
Yeah, in fact, I demand it.
Can you give us your handles?
That's my Twitter.
Excellent.
That's my Insta. I mean, I'm on Facebook too, but I'm not a public figure on Facebook. So follow my Twitter. I talk about trans stuff all the time. I talk about queer stuff all the time. I'm bisexual, and I talk all about bi stuff all the time. So if you want bi content, trans content.
Thanks, Heron. You're the best.
Yay. Hey, Nor, I'm going to download this chat because I want this love in my heart forever. Or can you send it to me?
Yep. So once we're done, I get a full recording of everything, and I'll make sure that we all have access to it once we're fully done. So
we all deserve to see love like this. And I cannot believe it. You guys have been so amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Have fun tomorrow.
We will. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Ha 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 ha.
Kate, would you mind moving to the next slide, please? All right, friends. I know that I am a downer after all of the excellent presentations and content you've had, but here to just wrap up a little bit of where we're going to be tomorrow. And thank you for everyone. I think we had 5 people drop off during this whole training, which is like kind of excellent, but please stick with me for like 10 more minutes while I walk through what the rest of this looks like and also answer some questions you all had about resources. So the first is we're going to be back at it tomorrow at 12. We're going to do a little bit of a tutorial on Slack. Could I get you to raise your hand if you use Slack already in your lives? Oh my God, a bunch of people. Bye, Catherine. I'll talk to you later. All right, so we have about 30 people that use it. I agree. I don't love Slack all the time, but it is going to be really, really useful for us because we'll be able to chat and collaborate, and I'll be sure to give you all a tutorial tomorrow. And then you can all download it. And it's basically I would say like a +20 version of like a group chat. Where you're able to have different channels on various topics, be able to attach files, to tag people, et cetera, and that's what we use for our digital defenders right now. So you'll be entering a Slack community that already exists and is up and running. And yes, it's similar to Discord, similar to Microsoft Teams. So after this, you'll receive a link to download Slack. And if you could do that before tomorrow, that's great. And if you can't, that's all right as well. 12:30 to 1:15, we'll have our third issue deep dive, which is going to be on climate justice. We'll have another break, and then we'll get into reproductive rights and freedom. And then we're going to have a section on how to actually engage online. So where you can spot those positive allies. We'll be doing a little bit more practicing and workshopping. And then we'll also talk through sort of like the do's and don'ts again and sort of bundle everything together. We'll also talk about the differences between different platforms, right? I know we talked a lot about Instagram and YouTube, but also what, how do we see these conversations emerge on different platforms and spaces? And then we'll go into debrief and questions and answers. So just answering a few housekeeping questions. Kate, if you could go to the next slide. Cool. So before you get into answering question number 1, Slack is where you'll be able to communicate with each other. So that's where you can share your social media handles with each other. I didn't want to go ahead and share everyone's information without everyone's consent. So you'll have to get on the Slack community in order to communicate with each other, and then you should feel free to share your social media handles with each other, so you can be friends and also help each other out. And another piece is that we have a volunteer agreement, which is important for you to fill out, and that helps us also know if someone does decide to really deeply engage with trolls, or someone decides to say something that is hurtful or disrespectful or counter-ethical to the Women's March principles or unity principles. Not that I think it's going to happen, but we have a standard volunteer agreement for everyone to fill out. So I will send that to you all in an email after this. It's also in the links Google Doc, and I am pasting it in this chat as well. So if you could just fill this out, that would be wonderful. And aside from that, let's talk through the question. So what was something new you learned today? So I will read out what I'm seeing. The Karen meme, the what to say exercises, I agree. Our deep dive into the Karen meme was fun. That this was a deeper dive into issues that I was aware. That we realized for me that we need a Karen meme version for people that are masculine identifying. I know we went through Jeff and Chad and Brad as possible examples to use. We talked about the rationale behind anti-trans feminism, the power of memes, learning about what the term cis is and what it means. The importance of framing my words to affect change in a more positive way. A lot of pluses and claps for Heron and learning more about anti-trans rhetoric, and then the constructive response framing to try to identify with people's values and build from there. Heron's presentation, how far anti-trans feminism or feminist rhetoric goes. And I learned about reframing immigrant rights by making migration a human right, and not making it exclusionary to families or those who are productive in society. Exactly. I thought that Amanda's framing and really understanding why the focus on family separation was something that was hurtful. And yes, unlearning the not using feminism in quotes when talking about TERFs is important. The importance of being explicitly supportive and a deeper understanding of trans rights. Thank you. So what I am going to do is, again, to keep sharing all of our different links, all of our different documents in that links document that you all have access to. Again, all of this information you will have after tomorrow, after you filled out the volunteer agreement. You will get everything and more, including resources that Heron and Amanda and others have curated in terms of reading lists and other resources to help us. So in the meantime, please take a look at Slack. Again, I will send all the links around, and I will see you at 12 p.m. tomorrow. So thank you, everyone. I appreciate you, and I hope to talk to you soon. And yep, Teddy, this is the link. I just posted it again to the agreement. So I hope that you can take a look at that. It should only take a second. Thanks, everyone. And all you need to do is hit submit, Catherine, on the form. I'll get it automatically. Just hit the, Catherine, you just have to hit the blue submit button at the bottom. Thanks, everyone. Yep, 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 p.m. Eastern. Judy, the volunteer agreement that it references is actually just the text in the form. So just making sure that you've read all the text. Mm-hmm. Let's just hang on to this for a second, Kate.
Meaning you would like me to keep my screen share happening?
Yes, please.